Okay, we are going to start talking about the later Middle Ages. We've been talking about how the Middle Ages developed and feudalism and all of those aspects of the Middle Ages that kind of led to the development of the Middle Ages. But now we're going to talk about how the Middle Ages started to kind of die out and end. First of all, throughout the Middle Ages, there were some major improvements in farming and in business in order to help these people thrive. The first was the three-field system. And this was a really efficient system where they were able to keep fertility of land. What they would do is they would only farm 2 out of the 3 fields at a time, leaving 1 that was left over to recover its fertility. So they had 3 fields, yet only 2 were being used. And then once the 2 were used, 1 would be left unplanted in order to keep it more fertile. This really helped food production and farming to increase, and they began to use this system on the manor, this 3-field system. They began to use this on feudal manors to kind of increase food production and increase population once this food production has been increased. Another thing that starts to happen is trade starts to happen within the towns. People from the manors would bring goods and food and agriculture to the towns on fair days, and they would trade and exchange goods there. And this led to the association of guilds. And guilds were just people who were all in the same profession that would get together, and they were in an organization called a guild. It would be similar to what we would think of as a union today. People of the same organizations, the guilds, would come together and they would put on these fairs, and without the guilds, the fairs really wouldn't happen. So the guilds really helped grow the business and the trade side of things during the Middle Ages. As trade grows, towns start to grow, and people are starting to abandon the feudal lifestyle. People start to move in and move into cities and towns and get out of the rural areas, and then we start to see a return to centralized government at this time. As you can see, as those things were taking place, we start to see an emergence of centralized power in England. There was a struggle for the English throne in the year 1066. This is the year of the Norman conquest, when William the Conqueror of Normandy comes into England and he claims the throne. And there was a battle there called the Battle of Hastings, in which William the Conqueror was victorious, and he is able to claim the throne of England. And when William the Conqueror of Normandy claims the English throne at the Battle of Hastings, this lays the foundation for centralized government in England. After this happens, England starts to turn into a nation state. Instead of small feudal states, we actually have the formation of a nation state. After William the Conqueror, you get Henry II, who goes even further to develop the government of England with strengthening the royal courts, introducing a jury into English courts, utilizing the judges to collect taxes, solve crimes, settle suits. So at the Norman conquest in 1066, this really turns the tide for England and turns it into a centralized power and establishes the monarchy in England. King John of England, Henry II's son, really begins to tax people heavily, imposes lots of taxes on nobles, and this leads to the signing of the Magna Carta. The nobles rebel against him and force him to sign the Magna Carta, which just means the Great Charter, which basically limits the power of the king. It guarantees basic rights to all free men, guarantees a trial by jury, and it requires the king to consult a council of nobles to instill new taxes. So the Magna Carta becomes a foundation for democracy and human rights during this time. So it's really important. The Magna Carta was an extremely important document, and this document was signed in 1215. So the Magna Carta really set the stage for human rights and liberties that we now enjoy today. This trend continued of the consulting the council for taxes, and it laid the foundation for the English Parliament, which becomes a legislative body or a law-making body in England. So it kind of, several of these things really helped centralized power in England to grow, and for central government to kind of solidify in England. The nation state became solidified. Okay, so here's your thinking question. How did the Magna Carta have an impact on our government today? Go ahead and stop and do this question. Okay, another thing that happens in the later Middle Ages is between the church, and we know how much power the church has had in the Middle Ages, but something happens called the Great Schism, and we know from past units that a schism is just a split. What ends up happening is the Pope in Europe begins to clash with the secular kings, and secular just means worldly, or they're not liking all the wealth, the spending, and all of the worldly things that the kings are indulging themselves in. So King Philip IV of France, he tries to appoint and assert some power over the bishops. Well, as we learned, that was a very touchy subject between popes and kings of who has most power. So Pope Boniface VIII issues a papal bull, which is basically like a decree or something from the Pope's hands that state the kings must obey the Pope. So he's restating that the popes will take any directives from the kings. So because of this papal bull, Philip imprisons the Pope Boniface, and although he intends to try him, he dies in his captivity. So a French pope then was elected in 1305, and this French pope does something very instrumental. He moves the papacy from Rome to Avignon, which is in France. In 1378, an Italian pope is selected, and he moves the papacy back to Rome. Now, because this happens, the French cardinals claim that this election was unlawful, that pope should not have, that was unlawful, that the papacy was now in Avignon, and they elect a separate pope in order to keep the papacy in Avignon, France, where they can have a lot of power with the king. So this is known as the Great Schism, because at this time there was a pope that was living in Rome and a pope that was living in Avignon, and there was two separate sides to the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was split. What eventually happens is both popes are dissolved, and there is one pope elected, and he resides in Rome. But the main thing you need to understand about the Great Schism was of the weakening of the church's power. After the Great Schism, people no longer had as much respect for the church. The church took a split, so some people were loyal to the church in Rome, some were loyal to the church in Avignon. So it really loses some authority and ground over people. And as we know, the church was such a powerful force during the Middle Ages. When it loses its ground, you're going to see some cultural changes. The church also loses its prestige with people. So people are no longer as willing to submit to the church as they were. So that was a great effect of the Great Schism. So thinking question, how did the Great Schism lead to the end of the church's power? Discuss some points on why you think that people would lose faith and lose their willing to submit to the church after the Great Schism. Okay, the bubonic plague, something you guys are probably more familiar with. Also known as the Black Death. This was another thing that happened during the late Middle Ages that kind of led to the decline of the Middle Ages. The Black Death was also known as the bubonic plague, like I said, and rats with fleas carried this disease, and they entered Europe through Asia. And the Black Death was known as a pandemic, and a pandemic is just an epidemic of infectious diseases that affected an entire population. So really, the Black Death swept across the entire population of Europe and affected just a tremendous amount of people. A lot of people blamed their sinful ways and sinful thoughts for the Black Death coming in. So people tried to pin a reason behind this happening. But what it did to the cities and to the people is it created a labor shortage, and population began to decline. And so because of this, many of the serfs were able to escape from that feudal system and go to towns to replace the workers that were dying off in mass numbers due to the bubonic plague. So this was something that was kind of led to the end of the Middle Ages and led to that feudal breakdown, was the bubonic plague. So here's your thinking question. List some of the economic and social impacts of the bubonic plague. Okay, finally, something that kind of solidified the ending of the Middle Ages was the 100 Years' War. And the reason why it's called the 100 Years' War is because it was fought over the span of about 100 years. And this was a war between England and France. What ends up happening is England and France, the French king dies without an heir. He dies without someone to take his place. So the King of England claims rule over the French throne. So this breaks out into a war over the French throne. What ends up happening is this war really strengthens the royal power in nations because the kings build up armies in this war instead of relying on their feudal armies like they had in the past. And people start to feel more loyal to their kings and nations rather than their feudal lords that they had in the beginning of the Middle Ages. So this kind of leads to a more of a nationalist loyalty that was really absent at the beginning of the Middle Ages when feudalism was around. So the 100 Years' War kind of turns the tide and people start to identify with their nations. Another thing that happens in the Middle Ages, or in the 100 Years' War, that really impacts the Middle Ages is new weapons. Before, you had mounted knights on horseback with armor, but now you have this invention called the longbow that's going to have a tremendous effect on the outcome of the 100 Years' War and really kind of help England gain some ground in the 100 Years' War. And also cannons emerge. Just to give you a brief overview of the 100 Years' War, the Battle of Crécy was a battle which English archers, using the longbows, were able to defeat the French. At the Battle of Poitiers and Agincourt, same thing. The English longbowmen, they were able to defeat the French forces. So these first three battles were extremely important for the English because they used the longbow in order to defeat the French, and they're making strides toward taking the French throne. After these three battles, really the era of that armored mounted knight that you saw so much in the Middle Ages really disappears. It's now these longbows, these men using these longbows and with arrows, defeating armies with that technology. But the most famous battle and the most famous person that we talk about coming out of the 100 Years' War is Joan of Arc. And this is at the Battle of Orleans. Joan of Arc is able to rally the French troops around the should-be successor to the French throne. And she's able to drive the English out of the city of Orleans. So she is able to really take charge and rally troops. And it really turns the tide of the war. And the French are able to come out in this war victorious because of Joan of Arc. And we know that her fate, eventually, she is burned at the stake for witchcraft. So Joan of Arc was a very interesting historical figure. She was a very strong woman, and she was able to lead the French to victory against the English in the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War, some of the interesting things about it is it really ends the Middle Ages and the fact that now you have these two nation states and you have more nationalism like I talked about, and all of a lot of this feudal culture starts to die out. So what I want you to do and really think about this question is I want you to tell me, how did these major events, everything we just talked about, lead to the end, lead to the wrapping up of the Middle Ages? Bring these questions with you to class complete, and we will go over them and